So, what is it about terrorism that you might find strange bedfellows one day? Hi, this is Phil Gurski, President and CEO of Borealis Threat and Risk Consulting in Russell, Canada, listening to Canadian Intelligence, which is a podcast about all things national security and terrorism related. In the past couple months and maybe years, we've talked a lot about terrorism, not just on this podcast, but on newscasts around the world. It seems to be sort of the soup du jour when it comes to transnational threats. And in the 2 decades after 9/11, there was really only one brand of terrorism that anybody cared about. And that was what we call Islamist extremism or jihadism. Not because of 9/11, it's not only because of 9/11, but the fact we had groups and attacks around the world, tens and hundreds of thousands of people killed in the past 20 years. What's interesting is that in the last couple of years, though, we've had a bit of competition when it comes to terrorism. And that's from what people call broadly right-wing extremism, white nationalism, white supremacism, neo-Nazism, and things like that. So much so that in President Biden's address to the nation last night, he actually said that the number one threat from terrorism to the United States is no longer the jihadis, but in fact white supremacism, which I found kind of interesting as a Canadian. But what is it about these groups that normally one would think can't stand each other, but there's actually some commonalities in the way they see the world? To answer this and other questions, I brought in Dr. Sara Kamali from the United States. She's a specialist in white nationalism and jihadism. And Sara, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast.
Oh, it's such a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much, Phil, for having me.
Easy question first, Sara. What in heaven's name led you to look at this phenomenon? I mean, I got an excuse. I worked in intelligence. What's your excuse for looking at white nationalism and jihadism?
It's a seemingly simple question, but a multi-layered response. But to keep it short, or try to keep it short anyway, really growing up in the post 9/11 paradigm, and then also remembering the remnants very early on in my life of the Oklahoma City bombing, and then
Mhm.
experiencing as an American citizen the dissonance between the two was essentially what led me to study both white nationalism and militant Islamism for over a decade now.
I think a lot of people, it's funny. You talk about, of course, this is the Timothy McVeigh attack in Oklahoma City in 1995, which I remember very clearly. I wasn't working counterterrorism at the time, but I was working in intelligence in Canada, in signals intelligence, and the catastrophic nature of that
Hmm.
attack. I'll never forget the cover of Time magazine showed an
Hmm.
Oklahoma City firefighter carrying this little corpse, a little baby, because there was a daycare, I believe, on the main floor of that Alfred P. Murrah building in Oklahoma City. So I'm assuming back then, because you're like eons younger than I am. What was the effect of you as an American seeing the images and thinking that, hey, an American did this to us, not some guy from overseas? An American decided to drop off a truck laden bomb laden with a truck laden bomb and blow up that building. What kind of effect did it have on you?
Hmm. Well, and not only an American, but American who wasn't of Arab descent, who was not Muslim. So that was the initial response in the media. Actually, was questioning whether or not an Arab and or Muslim had
Right.
actually perpetrated what has is still the deadliest terrorist attack perpetrated by an American on U.S. soil to date. Um, so, as with being very young at the time, it was disturbing that there was this possibility of violence happening in my country. So I'm a first generation American. My parents were actually from Afghanistan. They left in the late 1960s, soon after the coup, but they actually met in England. But that's a different story. But the point is that I knew since essentially as far back as I can remember that conflict. Was part of the nature of the world. But to have such a vicious attack committed in the country that I had known was unsettling to say the least. And so, really, that I think was what led me down the path of understanding what other groups have perpetrated violence. And then from there, again, a 9/11 happened a few years afterwards, the tragedy of 9/11. And then, of course, that changed the whole landscape in terms of national security and also civic and civil discourse. Um, with regards to so many facets of our lives as Americans. So that's when
Hmm.
the comparative element essentially came in. So I was
It's
always really thinking about these things.
it's interesting you raised that issue about, in the immediate aftermath of the attack in 95, there was this sort of incredulity that a white guy could have done this. And the assumption was it had to have been an Arab or a Muslim or that kind of thing. I do recall, actually, if memory serves me correct, there were a few vendetta attacks against American Arabs saying, your people were responsible for this act. So we're going to sort of, get blood for blood kind of thing. And yet, as it was just, some guy from, I believe he was from
Mhm.
Michigan, Timothy McVeigh, part of a militia group. I don't like the term militia personally. I think it undermines and understates what this problem is all about.
Yes.
So now you've gone ahead and you've written a fascinating book entitled "Homegrown Hate: Why White Nationalists and Militant Islamists Are Waging War Against the United States." Now, like normally, as I said in my introduction, we would have treated those two things separately because they're different types of terrorism, different types of ideologies. In actual fact, that I would think, based on my knowledge, that the two groups hate each other. I know sort of the Islamist extremists can't stand the far right, and the far right thinks that all Muslims are terrorists. I'm sort of channeling my no, not my inner Ann Coulter. I can't stand her, but this notion that not all Muslims are terrorists, but all terrorists are Muslim. Whatever, Ann. Um,
Yes. Yeah.
why was it that you chose to juxtapose these two apparently very different types of violent extremism in one book?
Mhm, mhm. So the organization of the book is a direct juxtaposition. So there is a whole section and several chapters devoted to direct comparison. But in the beginning, in the first two parts, I lay out the book such that they are separated by ideologies in order to lay the groundwork for understanding the comparisons. And the reason is because when the the book was actually always intended to be comparative in one sense, and I think growing up and also having a worldview and then having studying abroad and really seeking to understand not only the commonalities but how violence in the name of religion or in the name of political in the pursuit of political aims um, can be wielded and how different themes can be exploited. I think it was that lend itself naturally to comparison. So it's interesting because I do people do ask me why is this compare why did you even approach the book from a comparative angle, but that's really the only way to approach it because um well, essentially the Homegrown Hate is two books in one, so it's very
Mm.
comprehensive in terms of laying out the ideologies and beliefs and groups of both. um, but there are many similarities and I think trying to going back to Ann Coulter. um,
Please
uh,
don't. Please don't.
I think it is interesting that terrorism is specifically seen as a militant Islamist problem, and
Right.
that essentially criminalizes all Muslims in Canada, in the United States, around the world, essentially. And even though there may be people who say, "Well, I know a good Muslim, but well, gee, I'm not sure about the rest of them," kind of thing. So really, to be able to dismantle that um, erroneous conception of Muslims, and also look at how white supremacy plays a role in white nationalism and look at all the various factors. I think that comparison really allows for that push and pull, that tension that you talked about earlier too, that I do discuss in the book. Militant Islamism and white nationalism are certainly foils for each other,
Hmm.
and I think because of the similarities that they share in terms of their worldview, in terms of their respective um, respective sense of victimization,
Hmm.
of victimhood, and the narratives that that they exploit and proselytize in order to buttress that the need for violence is really interesting, and I think that they highlight each other in the comparative context.
Okay, let's get it right into that then, Sarah. You say there are similarities, and the average person in the street would say, "Nah, these groups have nothing in common. Like they're completely opposite ends of the spectrum." It's just like saying that the extreme far left and the extreme far right have anything in common. They don't. So, what did your research show in terms of the similarities between what one would normally see as disparate groups?
Yeah, thank you for that. So white nationalists most definitely have a narrative of victimhood, self-victimhood. So the way that I
Hmm.
categorize white nationalists in the book is that they're anti-government, they're racist, they adhere to religions that support racism, and they're conspiracy theory minded. And that doesn't necessarily mean that they have all that. They all share four categories, but they can be one and or an amalgamation of the other three. Um, and there is a narrative of victimhood in that white nationalists believe that there is a white genocide going on,
Right,
and
right,
that the numerical number of people of the white race are endangered of being extinct by immigration, by people of color, and that there is an existential threat to their existence. So too is there the narrative of victimhood as well as an existential threat, um, from the perspective of militant Islamists, though not posed by people of color or immigrants, but posed by um, American US led foreign policy
right,
in
right,
primarily Muslim majority nations. And so, how is that sense of how is that mutual sense of need for defense, how is that then leveraged in order to pursue political aims, which are also parallel? So white nationalists, the reason I use white nationalists is because it encompasses the term white supremacy, so the
right.
idea that there's something inherently biologically cultural superior of the white race, and the pursuit of a white ethno state. So whether that's Canada, the lands of the Americas, United States, northern Western Europe, Australasia, for example, and then militant Islamists also seek a global caliphate. So
Right.
there's this idea of soil, of territory as the end game. That is also parallel within these ideologies. So their worldview and their aims are very similar.
Do you think one needs the other in a sense that, if
Mm,
only one existed, that the other would somehow be lesser? Or is
mm.
this more, they kind of all, like you said, there's a shared sense of victimhood, although they're very different types of victims. I'm thinking here this notion amongst white supremacists, white nationalists, of this, le grand remplacement, which this
Yes.
French scholar has said, we're being replaced, we're being outbirthed,
Right.
we're being all kinds of things through immigration and stuff. Can they function without each other, or do they really need each other to make their point and to grow and attract people?
Right. Touching upon the Great Replacement Theory, that is something I discuss in detail because that's a common thread throughout many manifestos over centuries of white nationalist thought. So thank you for bringing that up. In terms of
Centuries.
mhm, centuries,
Wow.
yeah. So, I mean, if we look just not at the North American context, but also European context and how different ideas were shared through various pieces of literature throughout time. But to go back to your question of whether or not these ideologies and these ideologies need each other, I would actually argue that they don't specifically need each other. They're not dependent on each other.
Okay.
That being said, white nationalism definitely has a tenet of Islamophobia, and that's
Yes.
very much exploited. And then militant Islamists very often use
Yes.
the crusaderist
Yeah.
narrative in order to
Yeah.
prop up their self-victimization, their victimhood, their narrative of victimhood, as well as then the subsequent need for violence.
I think when most people think of right wing extremism, they generally tend to think of your country, unfortunately, as being one of the places where it's perhaps mostly deeply rooted. Certainly, there is some here in Canada. I would argue it's to a lesser extent. You do point out there's some in Western Europe as well. Do you think there's
Australia,
something special about the United States that lent itself to this development of a very robust, as you said, centuries old in many cases, movement of victimhood, this fear of replacement, this, you know, uh, anti-immigration. Of course, it wasn't always just anti-Muslim; it was anti-Irish in the 1860s. I still
right?
remember the what was that movie? I forget what it's called now. It was about 5 Points in New York, about the hatred of the Irish coming off the ships.
New York.
What is it about American history that you think maybe led to this notion of some people who just think that violence is necessary to keep their own way?
Mhm, mhm. Before I answer that, I would, yes, definitely. I know you said that perhaps white nationalism is not necessarily as great of a threat to Canadian national security as white nationalism is to American security. But in February of this year, I think the safety minister, Bill Blair,
Hmm.
yeah, there was the 13 groups who were
Yes.
essentially prescribed and called ideological extremism. Now, the reason I bring that up is because many of those groups are also operating within the United States,
Right.
which will tie into my answer to your question. So, for example, you have the Proud Boys and the
Yep.
Adam Waffen Division,
Yep.
as well as the Base.
Yep.
Um, and while those were under the groups considered ideological extremists by Public Safety Minister Blair, those are also operating within the United States. Now, white nationalism, as I see it, is a transnational issue, and for reasons we can perhaps discuss later. The what is specific to the United States that lends itself to January 6th, for example,
Hmm.
and I wouldn't say January 6th is the culmination, but another inflection point in the course of white nationalist history in the United States, is, we've had the denial of systemic racism in this country by many people in the media recently in the past 2 weeks.
Hmm.
Um, but because the nation was essentially founded upon the genocide of Indigenous Americans, as well as then um, essentially the threat of white nationalism has been minimized um, over the course of the founding of the United States. I think that has certainly lent itself to the flourishing of the white nationalist threat. Now, what do I mean by that? I mean, for example, the KKK has been around for a long time.
Right.
And that was essentially born out of the Civil War.
Right.
Um, yeah. But then there's been a whole confluence, and white nationalism is quite complex, particularly within the United States, not only among within the categories that I specifically talked about. There's been a lot of cross pollination of affiliations and memberships, and even religious adherence. Within the ecology of white nationalism within the United States, so I certainly think that what we see as white supremacy, which the extension or the aim of which is white, to have a white ethno state, is part and parcel of the United States. Now, if white nationalists are very much if the victimhood narrative of white nationalists is predicated upon the idea that people of color and immigrants are an existential threat to their existence, then what is specific, I would say, about the United States is that there is also this aspiration towards we the people, meaning people of color and everyone.
Hmm.
Whereas white nationalists, of course, would interpret that as being white, predominantly
Right.
men. Yeah. So I think the tension between the United States being seen as a nation imbued by God with specific blessings, as well as meant to be a Christian or
Hmm.
Christianist white ethno state, and then there's also the aspirational ideals of the United States as being welcome to all, um, and and uplifting of diversity,
Hmm.
is perhaps the context in which I can say that white nationalism is not necessarily worse, but that is what makes white nationalism so specific to the United States. Because white nationalism is a security threat for many countries in the
Right.
world.
It's funny. You read my mind when you talked about the whole Christian nature of this sense of victimhood. So let me ask you point blank. We talk about Islamist extremism, right? We tie it to an aberrant, non-normative, minority view of what Islam demands. Could we equally say that white nationalism slash supremacism is actually also Christian terrorism?
Mhm.
In
We
what
can
in
say
what
that
sense?
it
How would
is.
you understand that?
Yes, thank you. So I go into great detail um, mm, about examining the different religious viewpoints that uphold and teach white nationalism. So there's Christian identity, There's
Hmm.
white nationalist evangelicalism. There's Odinism or Wotanism.
Yes.
There's the lesser adhered to religions of cosmotheism, and creativity, for example. So there are a whole host of religions that actually support the idea of not only white supremacy in that there's a white race and that's biologically and culturally superior, and also divinely superior,
Hmm.
preferred by deity, um, but also that the United States and other territories are um, meant to be governed and inhabited by white people. So white nationalism is not only um, propped up by a certain understanding of Christianity, but also a certain understanding of of different religions, and also there are specific religions that are racist, like cosmotheism and creativity, because its founders were they were racist.
Right. You look at Islamic State, of course, or Al Qaeda for that matter, and all you have to do is change a few words, and they would say that, well, Islam is actually the only faith that's acceptable. And not only that, just certain Muslims are okay, the ones that we like, and the rest of you, like the Shia and the Ahmadis and
Hmm.
the Zaidis and whatever, screw
Hmm.
you guys because you're not the right Muslims and you don't belong here, kind of thing. So let's go forward to what's happening today, then, Sarah. As I said, President Biden, in his speech last night,
Hmm.
said a whole bunch of things. Speech was well regarded, I think. Well, certainly, it wouldn't have been
Hmm.
hard to go better than his predecessors' speeches. Pick any one of them, but. The one thing that struck me is he had a very short section on terrorism. He talked about the withdrawal from Afghanistan, which I'm sure you have a particular feeling about, being first generation Afghan American. Um, he talked about the continuing threat from Islamic State's affiliates, Al Qaeda affiliates, et cetera, et cetera. But then he said that according to U.S. intelligence agencies, so people after my own heart, that the single greatest threat from a terrorist perspective in the United States as of April of 2021 is in the far right, right wing extremism kind of thing. I was a little surprised to hear him put it that way, although this has been coming. This has been coming not just since January the 6th, but for quite some time now.
Hmm.
Were
Hmm.
you surprised at all to hear the president say that?
No.
And why not?
So, like you said, it's been a long time coming. Even I don't know if your listeners want a history lesson right now, but for example, even if we look at 2009, there was a report by DHS analyst Daryl
Yes.
Johnson, yes, and
Yes.
that was a quite that's now become a quite well cited report, but at the time it was vilified because it linked uh, veterans of the armed forces
Yes.
specifically, okay, to racially motivated violence, I think it was called at the time.
And he was hounded out of DHS
Right.
for saying that. Yeah,
Hounded. And then Secretary Napolitano at the time had actually apologized to veterans groups
I remember that.
because of that. Right. And then even before that, we have uh, reports that have now been declassified that have said, well, wait a second, we need to look at this because the preponderance of Christian identity groups, for example, going back to Christianity. So specific reading of Christianity, um, well, Christian identity is a specific reading of Christianity as they would have it that they're the sincere Christians, and that was really peaked in the United States in the 1980s and
Mhm.
even 90s, I would say. Um, so I was oh, and then we have Christopher Wray, the FBI director, even in the last during Donald Trump's presidency, who said, "Well, we need to maybe look at this a little bit more." Of course, he wouldn't necessarily have the support of the president at the
Yeah,
time of doing so.
right.
And then recently, we've had the within the Biden administration itself, we've had the Defense Secretary, so Lloyd Austin, as well as the Secretary of Homeland Security, Alejandro Mayorkas, both prioritizing white nationalism. Now,
Hmm.
within the government, it's known as racially and ethnically motivated violence, but I choose white nationalism not only because it centers the aim, which is to have a white ethno state, but it also uh, speaks to the perpetrators of the group, and I think it's much clearer and on par with what we've known about militant Islamists. Um, so I was not surprised.
Okay.
Now I that I hope that there are resources um, because the current counterterrorism paradigm is very much still focused on a post 9/11 landscape.
Right.
That's when the Department of Homeland Security came to be, of course.
Right.
So I would hope that the resources to counter what President Biden stated was the greatest national security threat to the United States would also be put into place in order to address the post January 6th reality.
Okay. So let me play devil's advocate for a second here, Sarah.
Yeah.
Um, okay. Full disclosure: I'm an Islamist extremist analyst. That's what I worked on for the security service for 15 years. I've written 6 books on the topic, so
Yeah.
that's definitely my bailiwick. So I've got a bit of a patch to defend here if I can. Um, you look at statistically around the world,
Hmm.
and the report that I rely on because I no longer have access to intelligence is the Global Terrorism Index, which
Hmm.
comes out every year. And last year there were just shy of 14,000 deaths in terrorist attacks around the world. All of but 89 of which were probably carried out by Islamist extremists. So, it's still 99.9% Islamist extremists. Now, every country is different. What do you think it is that, and I don't disagree with you, that white nationalism, whatever you want to call it, is a serious threat? I wouldn't call it existential. I don't think many threats are existential, with the exception of global warming, probably. But it has to be looked at, and I agree that resources have to be devoted to it. Why is it you think, though, that even as of 2019, which is the last year for which we have statistics, that like every death is a tragedy, but still the vast majority of actual casualties from terrorists, from violent extremism, are still perpetrated by Islamist terrorists? In other words, yes, we've got these groups like the Oath Keepers and the Three Percenters and the Proud Boys and the Base and all the ones that you cited and many, many more. We
Hmm.
still haven't seen a catastrophic increase in attacks which result in casualties anywhere in the world. To the same extent we've seen over the past 20 years with Al Qaeda and Islamic State and their affiliates, and Boko Haram and Al Shabaab and
Hmm.
Lashkar e Taiba, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Right.
Is there an easy explanation for that or not?
Right. Yes. There are the places in which white nationalists seek to claim a white ethno state. There is not the rife, um, there aren't rife wars going on.
Okay.
So I can, of course, elaborate on that a little more. I do acknowledge in my book that when I say, okay, white nationalism is a transnational terrorist threat.
Mm-hmm.
Militant Islamism is a transnational terrorist threat. In no way do I say that one denies the other. So
Right.
my explanations of white nationalism does not deny the reality of the scope of violence perpetrated by militant Islamists. Um, Militant Islam. Oh, and I do also take pains to discuss in the book that many of these cases are discussed in the European and American context, in the context of the Americas.
Right.
Um, so, militant Islamism is certainly a global threat, and it, of course, has resulted the actors themselves have carried out mass violence. I would also say that if we look where militant Islamists still have strongholds in terms of actual leadership infrastructure and group mechanics, etc., where they're actually able to operate, are very much in um, conflict zones.
Yeah, war zones. Yeah, Somalia, Nigeria,
Right.
Iraq. Yeah, Afghanistan. Yeah.
So the white nationalist ideology of wanting a white ethno state is not necessarily going to apply to those regions.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So this has been a rather depressing conversation, which you, but it's
Matter
okay.
what?
No, don't take it personally. I invite
No, no,
people
no.
to talk,
I
talk about these things. Um, where do we go from here then? We have a new president who, speaking as your northern neighbor, is orders of magnitude better than your previous one. Is there hope that we can get a handle on this, or are you more the are you the glass half full or the glass half empty kind of person when it comes to what people are saying is the rise, re-rise, third rise, whatever you want to call it, of white nationalism, or are you a Cassandra type that thinks that things might get much worse before they get better if ever? So I'm putting you on the spot here, Sarah.
Yes.
Are you an optimist or are you a pessimist?
Well, perhaps a cynical optimist. If uh, well, you said that a lot of people would think that the current president, American president, is better than the last one. But if that was the case, then I wouldn't necessarily have a book to speak about today. um, I would hope. Okay, quite frankly, we are in a very difficult situation because much of the landscape that has allowed white nationalism not only to flourish but to become normalized within the United States um, is very much still at play. So we have even the denial of systemic racism by many parts of the country. We have
Hmm.
the rise of conspiracy theories along
Right.
a whole host of ideas that the scope of disinformation as well is very difficult to actually agree on what words mean anymore, essentially. um, so I am hopeful in that the current administration, and I hope we'll see what happens going forward with future administrations, would use their time in office in order to put resources to counter and fully, um, you know, combat the threat of white nationalism and the reality of white nationalism. Not in terms of violence, but in terms of resources with
Mm.
people who are studying this issue, in terms of addressing the 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 histories of white supremacy and the ideas of white supremacy that lend themselves to think that the United States needs to be a white ethno state.
Hmm.
Um, and educational resources. I mean, even this week, the Idaho State Senate put on the governor of Idaho's desk um, a, a move essentially to ban critical race theory, and so any study of people of color and white privilege would be banned in the state. So we're living in, frankly, a dangerous time, and it's really up to people in power to take charge in order to ensure security from the top down. Now, I think, and that's why I spent a considerable amount of time writing about what I call holistic justice in the book, because I
Hmm.
was sincerely thinking for the past 12 years as well. If white supremacy, even though it's been denied several times this week by political commentators, that if and people in Congress who are making the laws, the systemic racism does not exist, but from my perspective, it very much does. And what the role of systemic racism does is it allows the idea that white people are inherently privileged to flourish, which then creates this normalization essentially of what we're seeing with white nationalism, and the ideas behind it and the platform of white nationalists, to really become imbricated and intertwined with institutions of power and systems of power within the United States. So I would say that the reason, I don't know, that what individuals can do is really understand histories
Hmm.
of each other, of their own communities, and of the communities of others, that I lay out in the new framework that I advance in the book. And really, that's so important because if we're looking at an undermining of of our own history to center white voices, um, then that's going to be very problematic to learn about the contributions of communities of color throughout the centuries. And
Right.
really, it's not just about textbooks, it's also about experiential learning. And I
Right.
think we're living at a time now where most places in the world, not only if it's not only about skin color and about political affiliation, there's just a divisiveness and a dehumanization of whomever we consider the other. And so what I call for in the book and what holistic justice calls for is to recognize that um, the corrosiveness of that division, and reach out to people and engage with people you normally wouldn't consider to speak with, because it's only through those types of connections that we're going to be able to prosper economically and live with any security. So it's in our best interest of everyone.
Of course. Of course. One last thing, Sarah. How can people get a hold of your book?
Uh, am I allowed to state different sites on here? Because I know some.
Absolutely. And what I'm going to do, once this post is published, I'm going to include those links in the actual podcast.
Oh, okay. Well, if you're a fan of the Amazon way, then go ahead and order from there. There's also a site. there's also
I'm for what it's worth, I'm not, but that's just me.
there's also it's that darn shipping. It's convenient, I guess, for most people. Um, I would ask your bookstore perhaps to call and support them. There's also bookshop.org, and you're welcome to check out my website that has links as well, sarakamali.com.
Okay, well, I'll definitely include that. Listen, Sarah, this has been a fascinating conversation, and when I thought about reaching out to you, I thought, this could be really interesting to see exactly what it is these two, as I said, almost sort of polar opposites when it comes to extremism have, and as you've shown, there is actually an awful lot of commonality. And I always used to say about terrorism, it really isn't complicated. There's just really three things. Is that something's wrong. I know who's behind it, and I got to kill them as a result. So it just seems that there's, people have this amazing ability to identify things they feel are wrong, and they figure out who's responsible for that wrong, and they figure out the only way to get any kind of justice is to kill them. So, thank you so
It's
so much
often
for
not
taking it. What's that?
And it's often not the person making the accusation.
Well, that's a whole other thing, right? You're absolutely right. Many people aren't the sharpest pencils in the box sometimes when they just go and try to figure out who's responsible for their grievances and their ills. But I do want to thank you very, very much for taking the time, Sarah, to talk to me today. It's a fascinating topic, and congratulations on the book.
Thank you so much, Phil. I sincerely enjoyed our conversation. Thank you so much for having me.
So that was my conversation with Sara Kamali on this very interesting juxtaposition between white nationalism and Islamist extremism, and all other things to do with the challenges facing the United States in the 21st century. What do you think of our conversation? You can reach me on email, borealisrescue@gmail.com, or on Twitter at borealissage. You can also find me on LinkedIn and Facebook. If you like the content and want to get more of it, go to the website, borealisthreatandrisk.com, hit the subscribe button. You get a free daily access. Also a link to my new book, The Peaceable Kingdom, The History of Terrorism in Canada from Confederation to the Present. Self-published, so you have to get it through me. Love to hear what you thought of this podcast and others. I'll talk to you again soon. Until then, stay safe.